Hello there, and welcome to this video guide to Romeo and Juliet. This is a follow-up to the videos on the context and background. And in this video guide, we're just going to look at how to go about starting to study the play and spend a little bit of time examining the prologue. So, when you're beginning to study the play, the first thing I would recommend is watch a version. Watch a film version, watch a staged version that's been filmed, or if you can, get to the theatre and see one. If you're not lucky enough to have access to the theatre, you really should get hold of a staged version. The Globe Theatre and the RSC both film and release versions of their plays that you can watch. And certainly recently, the Globe has been putting those up on YouTube for periods of time for free. And if you have the opportunity, check them out. And if not, you can get them on the Globe's own video player. There are lots of clips on there, and you can pay to download an electronic version of some of their productions. Why? Because actually this is a play. It's not a novel, and it was meant to be seen and heard. It was never meant to be read. Shakespeare didn't write his material to be published and read. He wrote it to be used in the theatre with his acting troupe in his theatres to bring people through the door to generate revenue that way. It's not the texts themselves that generated revenue. That's not to say that he didn't sell copies of his plays, but that wasn't where the revenues were coming from. It was coming from the plays in production, bringing people through the door. So you need to experience this text the way an audience is supposed to, which is to see it and to hear it and to hear the rhythms of the language and to see the characters interacting and to know that whatever Shakespeare's doing, he has an intention for it to impact on someone who's looking and hearing and not reading and analysing. That's not to say that you shouldn't get a copy of the book, of course. I would definitely recommend a copy of the text. We use the Cambridge Schools version just simply because they're quite good versions, but any version with kind of notes pages and glossaries and annotations is really, really useful. And even an electronic version, if you want to add lots and lots of your own annotations in, works quite well, but a physical copy of the play is really useful because you're going to need to read key scenes, you're going to want to make notes, and it's really useful to actually read some bits out loud. If you read Shakespeare out loud, if you put the language in your own mouth and you deliver some of those lines, even if, like some lunatic, you pace up and down corridors in your own houses delivering lines to the walls, it gives you a sense, a feel for what things are like. I mean, just look at the language that Shakespeare uses. It's I hate hell. You can hear the alliteration. You can hear that hissing noise, that tension in the back of the throat that you would give to deliver those lines. Have at thee, coward. And you can hear the hard consonant being used there in that piece of language. The plosive on peace, changing the word from a peaceful sounding word to a word that can be spat almost at Benvolio in kind of derision. And you really, if you get these lines, you get a sense of the fact that actually Shakespeare really was playing with the sound qualities. He was playing with the phonetics of the language. He's doing that on purpose, and he has a real sense of the sounds of the words and the sounds of the words in combination and the rhythm of the words. And you really do get this. And this is what you get if you watch and you listen and you hear. And it's certainly what you'll get if you read and you speak the words out loud. Shakespeare's audience really had an ear for the language of his plays. By the time we get to Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare is already a reasonably well-established playwright. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is relatively... It's in the earlier part of his career, but he's an established playwright, performer by this stage, and he has adapted his craft to suit the audience, and the audience have adapted their ear to listen to the rhythms of the language. It's something that they do probably more closely than a modern audience do. This is not to say that the audience weren't still rowdy, still likely to turn on you if they didn't like what they were seeing. It turns out that really wasn't an issue for Shakespeare most of the time. The plays were really very well received. He was essentially writing the blockbusters of his day. But his audience had an ear for this language, and Shakespeare had that keys into this using the language that he puts on the page. And to hear this, you have to watch a version, and you really do have to read the stuff. Before you start, it's really useful to try and work out what is it you already know. And a good way to do this is by producing a mind map. Mind maps mirror the way we think. They have these big ideas at the center, and from out of that we have these subdividing smaller concepts using what's called a radiant hierarchy. And you can even then put links between the different things in there, and you can color code things. And that's a very effective way, I think, of A, kind of identifying your knowledge as it is, and B, revising knowledges, because as you're starting to put things on the page, you'll notice more and more connections, and you'll remember more and more things. And it's unlikely that you're coming to the study of Romeo and Juliet cold. Shakespeare's audience certainly didn't come to the play cold. The story's a reasonably well-known one. You would have to, I don't know where you would have to have been not to have had some inkling of the story of Romeo and Juliet, even if you've never seen it or read it before or studied it. You have some sense of Romeo and Juliet. It's so embedded, not just in English culture, but globally. The story of Romeo and Juliet has reach and is repeated in from culture to culture to culture in various different ways. So it's worth identifying what you already know. What do you already know about Shakespeare in general? What do you already know about Romeo and Juliet and specifically? And in particular, if you're going to look at the play, and your knowledge of this, having maybe if you studied it in other key stages and years before you come to GCSE or whatever it is that you're studying, have a think, put down as much as you know about the plot, the characters, the themes, the techniques that you understand that Shakespeare uses, the language that he's using, and the context behind it. And before you start studying anything else, do that. Get that down there. See what you already know. Having a look here, we've got an example of a mind map which has got some stuff about the individual acts and individual kind of events that occur, and you can see they go from the bigger ideas out to the smaller ones, and they begin to show some of the links between them. And one of the key things to note is this is not heavy with language. You've got single words, and you've got visual imagery, and that makes it quite a nice way to go about doing this kind of knowledge blast of putting down what it is you know. So the next thing I would do is I would say to you, when you watch your versions of the play, keep a track of what happens. Get it in the right order. And this is where I think it is really important that you do pick your versions very carefully, and you make sure that actually alongside that, you maybe do a little bit of research to get a kind of glossary of the overview of the key scenes. Because if you get something like the Baz Luhrmann version, Baz Luhrmann produces a film. He's not filming a play, he's taking the play of Romeo and Juliet and turning it into a film, which means that he does some things. He edits events and shows them in different order. So you'll see Act 3, Scene 1 and Act 3, Scene 2 intercut to show them happening concurrently. When actually on a stage you have to have them happen consecutively. You see Juliet wondering where Romeo is as Romeo is chasing Tybalt down to get revenge. Now, these scenes obviously have to happen completely separately because you can't just cut between sequences. Stage doesn't work like that. You have to have one thing finish, move everybody off, put some other people on stage. So it's really useful just to check that. But you do need to have the idea of generally speaking, okay, what happens in the different acts? And again, getting it into your head that it goes act by act by act. Now, if you start with just a film version, then yes, by all means, just track the plot as it goes, and then subdivide that into the acts and the scenes when you start looking at the play. If you can get hold of a filmed version of the stage play, you will see the things subdividing into the acts much more neatly, and you'll have the events in the correct order. So that's always worth doing. And again, what I would say as well is it's often worth comparing two productions. You're comparing a stage version to a filmed version, or to a fairly authentic filmed version, so, to maybe a more modernized version. And looking then at how different scenes are staged, how different scenes are filmed. But also, going back and then comparing those to the original script and seeing, have we got a director here who's maybe changing the language a little bit? I think it's 2013 version sees some considerable rewrites of Shakespeare's English to make the language arguably more accessible. I personally think it butchers some of the rhythm of the language in places and isn't necessarily as helpful. I didn't find that a particularly useful thing. That is a very personal opinion. Of course, you may find actually that's quite an accessible version to you. It's all down to personal preference. But I'd seen quite a lot of and had studied Shakespeare quite thoroughly before that version was out. So obviously, I was not necessarily its intended audience. But again, just do be aware that whenever you look at a filmed version of the play, it is likely to have some variance from a classical stage production, and even then, not all stage productions are identical. But it's always worth having a look at a couple of productions and looking at what the differences are and why they're different, and particularly looking at characters and key scenes. I would always have a look at Act 1, Scene 5 and Act 3, Scene 1. They're both pivotal scenes. It's really interesting to see how those two are played. So when Romeo and Juliet first meet in the big sequence where Mercutio and Tybalt encounter one another. Again, it's worth then maybe creating a grid, cross-examining the two, looking at them and looking at why the differences, and most importantly, looking at dialogue and action and comparing those. Okay, so let's now have a look then at the play itself. And the first thing you're going to encounter is the prologue. So if you haven't watched versions of the play yet, pause this video, come back to it at another point, and then start it again, and we'll talk about the prologue. So if you haven't done that, stop that, go away and do that now, and then come back to this at a later point. If you've done that, great. Let's crack on and let's talk about the prologue. So the prologue is a bit what does come first and tells you some stuff. So there's a couple of dictionary definitions up there on the screen, as you can see. It's an introduction, and it is also a character. And whether it's called the prologue or whether it's called the chorus, it does the same thing. It is a person who comes on and tells you, oh, this is what's happening. Interestingly, if you look at Romeo and Juliet, most people know about the prologue here at the very start of the play. What you don't see is that there's actually a prologue in a scene later, but we'll look at that later on. The prologue does come back, and there's another kind of bit of narration. So the interesting thing about the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, the very first bit, is that Shakespeare starts the play by telling the audience what happens in the end. Yeah, that's really strange. He has a character walk out and goes, here we go. We've got a play to go on, and it's about two people who die. And the audience is like, what now? There's these two households, and they're having a bit of an argument, and they've got two kids, and the kids get together and they die. These two kids, and that stops the families from fighting. Whoa! You've just told the whole plot of the play. It's an odd thing. However, of course, it's not that odd. If you think about it, a couple of things to remember. Firstly, Shakespeare, if you've watched some of the early videos, you'll know, but Shakespeare didn't write this story. In fact, this story's been around for hundreds of years, predates Shakespeare by quite some time. And actually, Romeo and Juliet is a reworking of a pre-existing epic poem, which people probably knew about. And the generic story of the tragic lover's tale has been told and retold throughout history. So this is not an unusual story. And to tell everybody that here you've got a tragedy about two people, okay, they're going to assume it's a tragedy. It's about two people. Well, they're probably likely to be the ones who are going to die. So that storyline is familiar to 16th century audiences and 17th century audiences and so on and so forth. And also, people would have talked about the play. And Shakespeare doesn't want people just to come once. He wants them to bring their friends and come again and come again and come again. So it's not actually the knowing of the story that's the important element for Shakespeare, or indeed his audience. He's interested in drawing us in not to the what, but to the why. He wants us to discover. He wants us to think. He wants us to try and work out Why in the world has this happened? I'm going to DiCaprio theme it for a minute because obviously he's in this, but he's also in another film. He's in the film Titanic. Titanic was one of the biggest grossing box office hits of all time. And yet we all know, and apologies, spoilers, for those of you who don't, you might want to close your ears. The ship sinks in that film. At the end of it, that ship sinks. It's a matter of historical note, yet people still wanted to go and see it because they were interested in the characters and the things that occur. They weren't going, I wonder if the ship gets through. Oh my God, no, look, there's an iceberg. That's not what this was about. In this case, we watch and watch and watch, and it doesn't matter how many times we watch it, we're still with the characters going, don't do that. Oh no, why have you done that? Romeo, don't, no. Oh. We still go with them on that emotional journey. And that is the power of Shakespeare. And that is what he wants. That is the aim. It's the discovery of why. You don't go to a murder mystery and then go, oh my God, there's been a murder. You're kind of expecting that. It's not about the murder and who's died. It's about tracking down and filling in the details. That's what this is about. It's about how did we get to this situation? Why is there a tragic outcome and what's brought this about? So here we see the prologue. Two households, both alike in dignity in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. But he makes it clear from the start, you've got two households, both of equal status, and therefore, arguably, both equally to blame. And we place this in a specific geographical location, Verona. Verona had a reputation as a city that was seen as very romantic. It's a very beautiful city. If you ever get the chance, do go. It is a really interesting place. They've even got a Romeo and Juliet balcony. No, Juliet didn't really live there because she's a made-up character, but the citizens of Verona have capitalized upon this, and it's just interesting. You see people flocking to that balcony. But Shakespeare was capitalizing on the idea of setting his play in Italy, because this is a tradition with theatre of the time that if you want to criticize something that's happening in your own country, set it somewhere else and go, ooh, people over here, they do some really silly things. And I'm definitely talking about those people over there, not these people we live with, but those people. And that's what he's doing. He's setting this up and he's going, oh, no, I'm just talking about crazy Italians. Definitely not talking about rich folk in England. I'm talking about rich folk in England. He is doing what playwrights have done traditionally, which is they set the play in another place to make a comment about the place that they currently live in. Ancient grudge, break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. So here we see Shakespeare doing what Shakespeare does best, playing with words. Civil blood, innocent blood, the blood of the civilians, making civil, formally cultured, polite, and peaceful hands unclean. So we're seeing people who should be peaceful getting their hands dirty with blood, either because they're part of the feud or because they're forced to separate the feuding factions. As we later discover, Prince Aeschylus actually tells us, here you've had me bring out the citizen militia to try and part your fighting men, and they shouldn't be doing this. They shouldn't be drawn into this. So from forth the fatal loins of these two foes. It's a really interesting one. I was watched a video by David Crystal, and David Crystal is a professor of linguistics, and all hail David Crystal. Fantastic. If you get the chance to watch any of his videos or listen to any of his talks, it's always good value. But he looked in particular at English in Shakespeare's time, and he and quite a few other scholars have pointed out that actually the sound of English in Shakespeare's day would have been different. The pronunciation would have been different. And actually the sound loins and the sound lines would have been much closer than they currently are in modern English. And there's a joke in there. Shakespeare is nodding towards the fact that it's his lines of verse that are dooming the star-crossed lovers. It's from these lines that I give you that they take their lives, that they're both created and destroyed. A pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives whose misadventured piteous overthrows. Star-crossed, Shakespearean coinage here, this idea of star-crossedness, which we keep throwing out. Lovers are traditionally star-crossed. That's what they do. They can never have it smooth, because then there'd be no drama and tension. Nobody wants to watch a play about two people who get together and live happily ever after. That's not a thing. We don't want that. We need drama and tension. Even if they eventually live happily ever after, we can't have them just meet and be happy. That's no fun. So they have to have a certain amount of star-crossedness, of course. Romeo and Juliet turn the star-crossedness all the way up to 11, and he's indicating here, and he's throwing in the first of the motifs of fate straight at us here, that the stars are against them. Fate is against them. It's written in their stars that this is going to happen. There's nothing they can do to change this. And Shakespeare is very keen, right the way throughout the play, to reiterate this and reinforce this. We get this next line: whose misadventured, piteous overthrows do with their deaths bury their parent strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love. Misadventures, death-marked. Just in case you were missing this, this doesn't end well. They're going to die. It's bad. Naught but their children's end. We'll just remind you again, they're going to die. Yeah? This is a real hammer home to the audience. They don't make it out of this. And we get these two final lines, which is interesting. This is the point where he says, what I've missed out here, the next 2 hours will fill in, which if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, toil shall strive to mend. Note again the emphasis on ears. You're listening. You have to pay attention to the words. You have to pay attention to the rhythm. You have to listen, cueing the audience in. Shush now, time to listen. And again, showing also the fact that a Shakespearean audience would have listened attentively to the language of the play. So, what do we notice about the prologue? Look at this. Yeah, does that look strangely structured? Of course it does. Doubtless you already knew this, and if you didn't, it shouldn't be a surprise. And if it's a surprise, well, goody. Here's a bit of learning for you. This is what happens when you look closely at the rhythm and the rhyme scheme, and you suddenly realize that Shakespeare's prologue is a sonnet. It's a Shakespearean sonnet, so it's not a traditional Petrarchan sonnet. Shakespeare, although he wasn't the first person to use this variant of the sonnet form. He later on becomes kind of the past master at it, and it's named as a Shakespearean sonnet. That's one of the things, the names that it's given, because Shakespeare was one of the foremost exponents of it at the time. It's in his plays, but he also writes a series of sonnets as well. And the sonnet form is a poetic structure that Shakespeare is really well known for, and it has a conventional rhyme scheme, iambic pentameter. So you've got these rhythms that are strict, this line structure which is strict, and you have this rhyme scheme which is incredibly strict, and it follows a structure where you have a situation that is laid out for you in the first 12 lines, and then the situation is resolved or the question readdressed in the last 2 lines. And the prologue does exactly that. It's a traditional love poem. Shakespeare is signaling to you that this is about relationships, if you hadn't already spotted this, that this really is important. And this is important because it's not the only time it crops up in the play. It's something to look out for elsewhere as well. It's interesting to note that it is a traditional love poem, but Shakespeare developed this form and moved away from the purely courtly love Petrarchan style to express different ideas, not always about romantic love, about other various aspects of relationships as well. And here he's echoing the idea that he's demonstrating this is still about love and relationships by giving us a prologue which fits that form. So, just some things to remind ourselves of. The prologue is there to engage the audience in the action of the play, not the what, but we want to find out why things happen. It uses sonnet form to clue us into the themes, and it also establishes the key motif of fate right from the very, very start. So if you want to do any further reading and research, do look up the history of the sonnet form, find out about Petrarchan sonnets and how they worked and what they were for. look at Shakespeare's sonnets and the themes and ideas that he discusses in them too. So, thank you very much. I do hope you enjoy the play. Do get watching versions of Romeo and Juliet, but do also get into studying it and looking closely at the language because there's so much to see. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.